When I was growing up, I had the privilege of having a state forest right across the street from my house. There were miles of trails and woods to find adventure, and there were great hills for sledding in the winter, and we often went out on the ice when the reservoir froze over. The state forest was for the protection of the reservoir watershed area that we were taught supplied or helped supply the whole Boston metro area with water. And for that reason, we were never supposed to swim in the reservoir, although we did a few times at night. Not always clothed either. We were boys being boys. Well, we lived 2 or 3 miles from the reservoir dam. It was an impressive structure, maybe more than 80 feet high. And we would climb up the front of it until it got too steep and dangerous. And then we would see who dared to go higher still. And finally, good sense determined that we kind of started crawling back down. There probably were do not climb signs, and maybe even no trespassing signs. I don't remember. We used to climb over the fence to explore the spillway when the water was low. You know, boys will be boys. That was in the late 1960s and 70s. And we never saw anyone on security at the dam. And we never heard of anyone calling the police to report kids playing on the dam. There didn't seem to be a worry or a fear. That's the America I grew up in as a country boy. Even as kids, we freely hitchhiked for rides when it was farther than we wanted to walk. Well, at least boys did. About 10 years ago, my youngest brother remarried, and he took his new wife back to where we had grown up in Massachusetts to kind of show and tell about his adventures as a kid with his big brothers. He eventually took her to the reservoir dam. Now, to show her properly, he had to go over a fence. But in short time, a conservation officer appeared commanding him to come back over the fence. And he pointed out a no trespassing sign. My brother hadn't noticed it, and he tried to apologize and explain himself, but before he knew it, he felt handcuffs shackling his wrists. Those cuffs didn't come off for several hours. In the police station, he was cuffed to a post or some bar by a seat, and he wasn't happy. And he didn't handle it very well. But he received a lot of questioning. They did a lot of computer searches. And then they finally let him go with significant fines to pay. What made the difference between our experiences at the dam as kids and what happened to my brother in 2010 or 11? You might say, well, the world's got more crazy, irrational, dangerous people now. And that's true. But what event marks a huge change in the world that makes bridges, dams, tall buildings, and government buildings high security concerns? Yeah, we're talking about 9/11. 9/11 changed things. Now, in my brother's desire to share with his wife his earlier life of adventure, he had forgotten that 9/11 changed the world. Or maybe he didn't really comprehend how much it changed the world, how much it changed America. Now, we're dealing with a prophecy today about change in America. And we're going to get into some pretty challenging things. Yeah, there's the title, From Lamb to Dragon. And I really like, Cheryl Curtis set these slides up for me, and I really like this one. Kind of captivating. Well, this is the key verse for today, Revelation 13:11. Then I saw another beast coming up out of the earth, and he had 2 horns like a lamb, and he spoke like a dragon. Now, you know that in the book of Revelation, this is another beast. This is the second one. In Revelation, there's a first beast. And that during the Protestant Reformation, all the reformers and all the Protestants believed that the first beast of Revelation 13, the leopard-like beast that came from the sea, represented the papacy. However, this second beast that came up from the earth, they didn't know. Why didn't they know it? Why didn't they know who the beast with lamb-like horns was that would speak as a dragon? Well, because it hadn't come up yet. There was no hint of it yet. The reformers were living in the last phase of papal dominance. You know, when the Pope was taken captive by Napoleon's general in 1798, that marked the end of the rule of the first beast and the time the second beast should arise. And so it wasn't until about 1850 that somebody saw the obvious. His name was John Andrews. He first wrote out the details identifying this second beast with the lamb-like horns as the rise of the United States of America. And in her book, The Great Controversy, Ellen White agrees. It's in chapter 25 in Great Controversy. The stuff about the first beast and the second beast on page 440. Now, on the next page, 441, she explains the 2 lamb-like horns. And I love her explanation. She said one of those horns is for civil liberty. The principles from the Declaration of Independence written by Thomas Jefferson, that all men are created equal and endowed with the inalienable right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. She also said that the Constitution of the United States guarantees people the right of self-government, that is, to elect representatives, to serve, to enact laws, to administer those laws. And she said this form of government is called republicanism. Republicanism is a form of government, not a party in this case. So one horn stands for civil liberty personally and a Republican form of government. That's how Ellen White describes it in Great Controversy, page 441. So what would the second lamb-like horn represent? It would be the spiritual side of it, right? Religious liberty. And I'm quoting her, she says, freedom of religious faith. She says that all men granted every man being permitted to worship God according to the dictates of his conscience. In her day in America, this was called Protestantism because they saw Protestantism as religious liberty in America. Now, Europe, that wasn't so clear, but in America, they kind of equated it. And so when she says the second horn was Protestantism, I can't even say that word right. She's talking about religious liberty, and she explains it well enough. So the second horn symbolized freedom of religion and Protestantism. Now, these principles of civil and religious liberty have drawn millions of people over the past 2 centuries to come to America. This land has been a refuge for the oppressed and downtrodden from many other lands. I'm not saying that's the only reason people come. A lot of people come because they hope to make more money, but that's more recent. In earlier days, it was for freedom and almost only freedom. All right, but for centuries, people have come and this has been a refuge. It's been a hope. It's been a beacon of light. It's been a new start for millions. And I'm just sharing how Ellen White describes it. According to Ellen White, civil and religious liberty have been the principles, the secret of its power and prosperity. Because God's blessings, the Bible says righteousness exalts a nation. as long as those principles have been upheld, in spite of problems that God behind the scenes works on, he still has been blessing this country. So, has the rise of America been all good and glorious? Were some people left out of the all men are created equal ideal? Not all received life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, did they? Did Ellen White not know that slavery was practiced in the first 80 years of U.S. history when she wrote those glowing things? Of course she knew. And she and all the early Sabbath-keeping Adventists were very much against slavery. In fact, you might not know this, but most Seventh-day Adventists at the church's beginnings in the 1860s didn't think Lincoln was strong enough against slavery, and they didn't approve of Abraham Lincoln. Did you know that? Because the early Adventists were very strong abolitionists, and they saw Lincoln as pandering, waiting for political opportunity instead of just doing what was right. And they viewed him as the circumstances finally got him to do the right thing. But in spite of slavery and in spite of war, she still wrote wonderful things about the principles of the United States, the principles the United States was founded on, in spite of the fact that those principles were not applied to everyone. They were still great principles of freedom, even if mankind tends to mess up a lot. Now, recently, I've seen some online discussions among Seventh-day Adventists where one prominent person is claiming that the United States has spoken as a dragon right from the beginning because of slavery and the mistreatment of the Native Americans. Is it true? In a sense, it is speaking as a dragon to institute slavery. According to Ellen White, to legislate enslavement is speaking as a dragon. It was an omen or a harbinger of something more extensive to come. On the other hand, the speaking as a dragon in Revelation 13 is a prophecy of an end-time crisis, something different. The Bible in Revelation 13 describes when the beast with the lamb-like horns speaks as a dragon. Verse 12 says it's when it exercises power to cause the world to worship the first beast whose deadly wound was healed. That's when it speaks as a dragon, according to the Bible itself. The following verses describe it as setting up an image to the beast, an image to the first beast, and enforcing the death penalty on those who refuse to worship the image of the beast and receive his mark, the mark of the beast. This is when the beast with the lamb-like horns speaks as a dragon. This is when it fulfills Bible prophecy. The USA has never been perfect, far from it. But it arose according to Bible prophecy as a land of freedom. And, when I say it arose according to Bible prophecy as a land of freedom, I'm thinking of Revelation 12:16, where it says that, this is the passage where it says, the serpent went after the woman in the wilderness for a time, times, and dividing a time. And then it says, the serpent cast out of his mouth waters as a flood after the woman that might cause her to be carried away the flood. The next verse, 16, says, the earth helped the woman. The earth is the land the beast with the lamb-like horns comes up out of. The earth helped the woman. The earth opened her mouth and swallowed up the flood, which the dragon cast out of his mouth. And so God's design was for this nation to rise to be an escape valve for the persecution in Europe. And it worked. It changed everything. There was a place to go. The Lord himself made this possible. God prepared it. Now, I'm going to share with you a statement from Maranatha 193. It says, the Lord has done more for the United States than for any other country upon which the sun shines. Soak that in, folks. Here he provided an asylum for his people where they could worship him according to the dictates of conscience. Here, Christianity has progressed in its purity. Just because it's not there anymore doesn't mean this isn't true, okay? The life-giving doctrine of the one mediator between God and man has been freely taught. God designed that this country should ever remain free for all people to worship him in accordance with the dictates of conscience. He designed that its civil institutions in their expansive productions should represent the freedom of gospel privileges. So, serious question here, we see here God's design was for the United States to be a blessing to all people. So why did everything not turn out perfect for all people? Why did some get left out of the blessings at the beginning? Why didn't God overrule the slavery problem right from the start? These are not easy questions to answer. But history sometimes reveals that God allows things to play out in a natural cause and effect way. History also shows that slavery has been the norm in almost every land and age, all through history. That doesn't excuse it at all, but God has allowed a lot of bad stuff in this world because he doesn't overrule freedom of choice. But he works through people, through movements, to in times get things righted if people will go with it. Now, let's consider briefly, just a little bit, of what the founders of the United States had to deal with. They came to this thing called the Constitutional Convention. And what did they have to deal with to write a ruling document for how to operate a brand new country made up of states that were used to having their own rules and being proud of not being like another one and so on? What do we call this document they wrote? It's called the Constitution of the United States of America, right? Now, so what were the challenges? And I'm just going to bring up two. The first one I'm going to bring up is representatives from the little states with lower population were exceedingly worried that the influence of the larger states would leave them in the dust. And so they didn't want a legislature that was determined by population. The larger states wanted that type of legislature where they would be the power brokers. Well, that was one problem. How are they going to solve that? And the other one, the obvious one we've been dealing with already, is states that had slavery didn't want to cease just because other states didn't have slavery. Now, with such fears and obstacles, how would agreement ever come about to form a United States? Well, they did a remarkable job. Overall, the Constitution was a great success. And years later, William Gladstone commented on it. William Gladstone was a prime minister of Great Britain in the second half of the 1800s. He was chosen 4 different times, and he's considered one of the great statesmen in British history. This is what he said about the Constitution. He said it was the most wonderful work ever struck off at a given time by the brain and purpose of man. So this great statesman who had all this British history of parliamentary and legal documents considered the United States Constitution the zenith of human political achievement. He recognized some things in it that he thought were remarkable. Now, a fellow by the name of Clinton Rossiter, he was a renowned American history and political science professor at Cornell University, and author of many books that were published in the 1950s and 60s. He actually saw the Constitution similarly, but he gave a different angle on it. He said that the Constitution was a bundle of compromises and a mosaic of second choices. Well, you can understand with the differences they had, were they going to be able to let one side get their way and another side not? So there were many compromises in the Constitution that have worked out well to this day. Let's deal with one that worked great. The compromise with the small states and the large states. You see, the small states, they did what's called a bicameral legislature, 2 houses instead of 1. In the Senate, small states have equal power with large states. But large states have more influence in the House of Representatives. Wow, it's been working. Now, at the Constitutional Convention, well, there was one compromise made at the Constitutional Convention that eventually failed, and that was the one to try to bypass the slavery issue. At the Constitutional Convention, think about this. If those who were against slavery insisted that slavery be ended, what would have happened to the convention? Majority would have walked out. And there would have, what would have happened? I mean, what would have become of this new country if there was no agreed upon ideals for how to run the country? It just would have been a land of chaos. Every state doing its own thing. It wouldn't have been a United States. It would have been a very fragmented, I don't even know if it would be a country very long. But here's a very important point to note. At the time of the Constitutional Convention, at that time in history, in North America, slavery wasn't very profitable anymore and had been in decline. It had phased out entirely in some of the northern states. Many believed that it would phase out on its own, that it would resolve itself in 20 years or so. So they decide the only way they could get the Constitution written was to not try to resolve it. But they had one big argument. They had one big argument still, and that was those who favored abolishing slavery said that states that were permitting slavery couldn't count the slaves as population for calculating how many representatives they could have in the House of Representatives. They said, you can't count your slaves when you're going to choose representatives that won't represent them. And of course, the slave states wanted to count all their slaves to get a higher number of representatives so they had more influence in Congress. The arguments went on and back and forth. And what was the end result? The end result, it's really completely silly, was a compromise to count 3/4 of the slaves, but not all of them. Kind of silly, but that's what it took to move on and agree on a constitution. Now that part got removed 80 years later when the North won the Civil War and slavery was finally ended. Now, the Civil War came many years later, so what went wrong? How come slavery didn't go away like they thought it would? Well, here's the big problem. The founders were greatly disappointed. Most of them didn't live long enough to see how wrong they had been. And it was all because of one invention. Anyone know what the invention was? I heard it, the cotton gin. Somebody paid attention in U.S. history class. And that was years ago, a great memory, right? See, cotton could now be processed in a very large and profitable quantities if one had a sizable labor force. And 20 years after the Constitutional Convention, slavery had grown instead of phasing out in the South. Now, it did phase out in the North entirely. And people in the North were getting stronger and stronger feelings about things that they were hearing. Think of Uncle Tom's Cabin and things that inform people. So the people in the North, a lot of them begin to see slavery as an enormous and tragic injustice, which it was. Now, what a lot of people don't know is most of the people in the South didn't even own slaves. About 25% actually did. But those 25% were mostly the rich plantation owners that had a lot of acres that they could plant cotton. They had influence. They were the people who had the money. And yet their guilt was increasing with time. The abolitionist movement in the North and the wrongness of slavery were on a collision course. Debates and compromise for 4 decades in Congress kept war from breaking out. But when Abraham Lincoln was elected president, and I want you to understand, he was elected without a majority because 4 people were running, and he didn't get a single vote from the southern states because they knew he was against the expansion of slavery. And because of no majority vote, because the Southerners felt like he wouldn't be favorable to their cause, Southern Democrats began to lead their states to vote for leaving the Union of States. They left the United States of America and formed their own country. No one has ever been elected president and been that unpopular. No one ever close. It's interesting because Abraham Lincoln is a hero to us now, and we don't realize that when he started out, he was the most hated president ever elected. But it was in a segment of the country. Obviously, he won because he got votes from the North and the new Western states. Well, this new country formed in the South had a problem. And that was that all the forts in the southern states were the property of the United States government. And Lincoln refused to turn them over. And when the Southerners turned cannon fire on Fort Sumter in South Carolina, the Civil War was started. Abraham Lincoln made sure they started it.